It's great to see such a good turnout. So much, great to see folks from the College of Journalism and Communication, the community, other colleges. Welcome to all of you. This is an informal colloquium, so if you want to grab some coffee or snacks as we're talking, I'm sure you won't mind, right? Okay, good. And there will be plenty of time for questions and comments associated with this talk, so I look forward to hearing all of your reactions. This is the second colloquium sponsored by the STEM Translational Communication Research Program, a new initiative here in the College of Journalism and Communication. And our basic mission is to help translate what the research means for various stakeholders and various audiences. So we welcome you. If you have any questions about the program, please let me know. If you're interested in becoming an affiliate member, all we need is a copy of your CV and a brief statement of your interests, and we would be happy to add you. I want to thank Lily Rodriguez, the assistant for the program, for all her help in organizing this colloquium, and especially Dr. Brendan Nyhan for coming all the way from Dartmouth to be with us today, as well as our co-sponsors, the CTSI and Frank. So Dr. Nyhan is an assistant professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College. His research focuses on political scandal and misperceptions about politics and healthcare. He's been published in a number of respected journals, including the American Journal of Political Science, the British Journal of Political Science, Pediatrics, Medical Care, Vaccines, and Social Networks. He's a contributor to the New York Times politics policy website, The Upshot, and he also co-authored All the President's Spin, a New York Times bestseller named one of the best 10 political books of 2004 on Amazon.com. Thank you so much for being with us today. Help me welcome Dr. Nyhan.
Thanks. It's a real honor to be here. I appreciate you all coming during spring break. We have a really interesting audience here, so I hope to hear from all of you and your thoughts and reactions to this. I mean, it seems like there are a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds here, and this research is very interdisciplinary. I think it's very in keeping with the spirit of the translational communication efforts that are being done here. So I'm a political scientist, but I'm going to be sharing results with you about how difficult it is to counter misperceptions that extend from politics to healthcare to other areas of science. And I think a lot of the lessons that come out of this research have applications in other fields, so I'd be interested in your thoughts about that as well. I want to start by acknowledging my principal co-author, Jason Ryford, at the University of Exeter in the UK. There's some other co-authors on these articles along the way, and I'd, of course, be happy to share the full copies of the research I'm sharing with you if anyone's interested. So please just email me if you would like a copy. OK, so why am I here? So the problem I'm interested in is why people believe things that aren't true, things that are false or unsupported by the best available evidence. And there are any number of these misperceptions out there, from the so-called death panel myth about the Affordable Care Act when President Obama was proposing healthcare legislation in 2009, which still echoes in the debate over end-of-life care today, to the belief that vaccines are poisoning our children or are somehow dangerous, which is an issue, again, that's been in the news recently because of the measles outbreak at Disneyland. Okay? The question is, why do people believe these things, and what can we do about it? Okay, that's what I'm really interested in. Now, the problem is when these sorts of myths crop up, our natural response, I think, especially those of us who think of ourselves as scientists, is to give people facts and information. Or maybe if you think of yourself as a journalist, you're to give people facts and information. Right? This is sometimes called the deficit model, and the idea is people don't have the information they need, and so we should give it to them. Right? They just lack the correct information. Right? And so that's the kind of world we all like to think we live in, right? Is that people will react like the guy in this cartoon when we bring them the correct information. It's a really appealing sort of notion, and it's one that, even if we might not put it quite so baldly, underpins a lot of what we do in education, health, medicine, and journalism. Okay? The problem is it's not actually the world we live in, at least when it comes to controversial issues, issues that touch on aspects of people's identity, their belief systems, controversial issues that make people very emotional. Okay? The reactions we get often look more like this, right? When we give people that information that they're uncomfortable hearing, that's unwelcome. Okay? And there's a psychological phenomenon that turns out to apply here even when it comes to factual information, and that's called disconfirmation bias. And the idea is when you're given information that's inconsistent with your prior beliefs or attitudes, you're especially skeptical of that information. You tend to resist it. You don't necessarily accept it. Okay? And the flip side of that, of course, is confirmation bias, right? When we're told that we're correct, we all say, of course I'm right, right? We're not skeptical enough of those sorts of claims. Okay? Now, the thing that's interesting is that disconfirmation bias seems to apply as much to facts and factual beliefs as it does to opinions. Okay? And that's something I think we haven't appreciated as well as we might have until recently. Right? It's perfectly normal for me to say, for you or me to say, well, I'm not going to change my party affiliation based on one new piece of information. Right? That's a kind of disconfirmation bias, right? But when it comes to facts, this can have some really perverse effects that I'm going to share with you. And we really would like people to update their factual beliefs in response to new information. And it turns out that not only do they not necessarily update those beliefs, but sometimes they can actually, this reaction can actually move people in the opposite direction of what you intend. Okay? And it's that unexpected response that I think we have to be cautious of in the public communication efforts we undertake, whether it's in politics or in health. And I should say, by the way, interrupt me with questions anytime. I don't mind. Okay? I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. But as we go, if you have questions, just jump right in. Okay? So again, just to make clear what we're talking about, I'm thinking of beliefs that are either false or unsupported by the best available evidence. There are a number of misperceptions that we can't, with 100% certainty, rule out. Okay? But they are inconsistent with the best available evidence. Right? I can't prove to you that Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction aren't in a cave in Syria somewhere. But everything we know suggests that's not true. Right? I can't prove to you with 100% certainty that the Earth is warming, but there's an overwhelming scientific consensus that that's the case. Okay? And so that's how I'm defining this here. Okay. Now, a key distinction that's often been missed when we think about these sorts of issues is the distinction between being uninformed and being misinformed. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time in social science documenting the extent to which people are uninformed. Okay, so we ask them all sorts of trivia questions on surveys and then wring our hands about the fact that they can't answer them. Okay, so who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? How many votes does it take to override a veto? People don't know the answers to those sorts of questions, right? You're all now thinking, oh, geez, do I know the answers to those questions, right? Those are hard ones. Those are the hard ones, right? But some of them, even who's the vice president, a number of people don't know the answer to, right? And so in my field of political science, we spent years and years asking these sorts of questions. And it turns out people don't know the answers, okay? But I would submit to you that in a lot of cases, people don't, it's not clear why you need to know who the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is to cast an informed vote for president. And then maybe even more importantly, you recognize that you don't know who the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is most of the time, right? When it comes to these misperceptions, the story is different. People often hold these beliefs very confidently, and that's part of why they're so difficult to correct. Okay. Another reason that they're so difficult to correct is because they're often tied to these existing beliefs or attitudes that I mentioned earlier, aspects of people's identities or belief systems. Okay? That's part of what helps them get off the ground in the first place. It helps them get traction among the public. And then once they're entrenched and they're linked to those beliefs or attitudes, it can be especially difficult for people to let go of them. Okay. So what I think, the conclusion that I would at least propose to you is that misperceptions in some cases might be worse than a lack of knowledge. Okay? And there's a great quote that I'd like to share from a contemporary of Mark Twain's. Some of you may have seen versions of this that are actually erroneously attributed to Mark Twain, which is appropriate for a talk about misperceptions. It gets chopped up in different ways. It's kind of meta in that way. So he said, "It is better to know less than to know so much that ain't so." Okay? And what he's saying there precisely is, in some cases, it's better to be uninformed than to be misinformed. Right? And so he was onto this in a certain sense even that long ago. Okay? But in social science, we haven't really recognized the importance of this distinction until recently. All right, so how important are these misperceptions? Well, they're incredibly prevalent, okay? One instinct people sometimes have is to think of these as something that a tiny fringe of Americans believe, right? But this isn't like the people who think the moon landing was faked, right? That's maybe 3 to 5% of the American public. We're talking millions and millions of people, Okay, so here are data on two of the most prominent misperceptions about the last two presidents. The belief that the Bush administration aided or allowed in the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and the belief that President Obama wasn't born in this country. Okay? This is a poll taken in 2006 for the 9/11 conspiracy and 2010 for Obama. Okay? And I want to highlight two things about this graph. First, I talked about how the importance of people's existing beliefs and attitudes. And you can see for both of these misperceptions, there's a steep partisan gradient. Right? The partisan group that would be most predisposed based on their party affiliation to believe in the myth is much more likely than independents, and likewise for the opposite party, right? And then going the other way here, okay? And then in the partisan group that's most vulnerable to misperception, either Democrats or Republicans, more than 40% of them agreed with these statements, okay? So again, we're talking about millions and millions of Americans. This is not a fringe phenomenon. This is something that, you know, a substantial portion of the public are at least vulnerable to. Okay, yeah, please.
I'm so sorry, but to restore my faith in people's reasonableness,
Yeah.
is there any chance that those were, you know, 7 scale and people will mostly agree, so it was not all, you know, that yes or no, yes, I do agree that it was a conspiracy?
Yes, yes. So these are people who are at least, I'm collapsing the response scale, so this 9/11 conspiracy is somewhat agree or agree. Okay? So it's not like I'm 100% certain there was an inside job, but I'm not saying it wasn't true either, right? Yeah, no, fair point. And that's true of a lot of these, actually. Like the debate right now about whether President Obama is a Christian or loves this country. There are lots of people, when you ask polls, say, oh, I don't know, right? So they're not rejecting the false claim. Okay. All right. So I told you earlier that people often hold these beliefs very confidently. I want to share some evidence from some research I've done showing how that works and why it might make misperceptions especially difficult to correct. Okay, so these data are from surveys taken during the last two big healthcare debates in this country, the Clinton healthcare reform plan of 93 and 94, and the Obama healthcare reform plan of 2009, 2010. Okay, the left panel is Clinton, the right, Obama, and it's focusing, the data are focusing on the most prominent misperceptions about each of those plans. Okay? For the Clinton plan, the most prominent misperception was the claim that you would lose your ability to choose your own doctor even if you paid out of pocket, which was false, explicitly excluded by the text of the bill, but still widely popularized at the time of when the debate was going on. On the right is the death panels myth created by Sarah Palin, which came out of an earlier claim involving euthanasia. We can go into the details of that if you want. But here's the important point about these. In both of these cases, these pollsters asked people, how much do you think you know about the plan in question? Right? So subjectively, how would you rate your understanding of these bills? Okay? And as people moved from saying they didn't know very much about this bill to saying they know a lot, an interesting thing happens. For the partisan group that's most vulnerable to the myth, that's most predisposed to believe in it, those folks who thought they knew more about the bill were actually more likely to be misinformed. Okay? In both cases, their perceived knowledge of the bill went up, their misperceptions went up, not down. Okay? So they thought they knew more, and they actually knew less. And you can see why it might be hard to change people's minds under those circumstances. Okay? All right. So ultimately, the problem is none of us like to admit that we're wrong. Right? It can be very disconcerting. Okay? And I should just say, we're all guilty of this as human beings, okay? It's easy when you give a talk like this to think, this is everybody else and their problem, and you know, I don't do this way. We all do this, okay? We all do this, okay? And as I'll talk about, sometimes it's even more educated and knowledgeable people who do this more and are better at it, okay? Which means people like all of you in this room, okay? And me. So what's going on? Well, we think when people hear this information, it's uncomfortable to think that they might be wrong. And that disconfirmation process causes them to counter-argue that information they don't want to hear, okay? To resist it, to think of reasons not to believe it. Okay? And in the process of doing that, it can take them to some pretty unexpected places. Okay. So just a little more evidence on how difficult these misperceptions are to correct. This is a prominent misperception from the Bush era. You might remember the belief that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, okay, immediately before the US invasion. Right? That claim was widely made and widely believed before the US invasion, but of course, no weapons of mass destruction were found, no active weapons of mass destruction program were found, and you would hope then that people's beliefs that this was true would update, right? This would shoot down to 0, right, as people learn. This is a hard fact to avoid circa 2004, okay? We'll exempt the undergrads who are like 10 at the time, right? But for those of you who are older, remember, this is pretty hard to avoid. Some of these you might say, well, maybe people never saw this information, right? But what happened, the aftermath of the Iraq War, the lack of weapons of mass destruction was really big news, okay? And yet, the percentage of Americans who said Iraq had weapons of mass destruction plateaued around 40%, okay? The polls basically stopped being done around 2006, but one of my colleagues at Dartmouth re-polled this in 2012 and got about 40%, okay? So it doesn't seem like people are updating their beliefs. Okay. Let me show you one more example. Okay? And this is an example of how knowledge can have effects you might not expect. This is, does anyone remember seeing this tweet in 2012? So the unemployment numbers came out in October of 2012. It's going to be the last unemployment data before the 2012 election. And they were slightly lower than expected. Okay? They dipped just under 8%, which people had falsely made into this magic threshold of importance for the election. And so they were lower than expected. And Jack Welch, who's the former CEO of General Electric, this is not some random crank on Twitter, tweeted that the Chicago guys have changed the numbers, right? So it's basically a conspiracy theory that they've been monkeying with the numbers. This is rejected by every economist. The office that does this is insulated from the other parts of the Department of Labor. It was run by a Bush appointee, blah, blah, blah. I can bore you with details of why this isn't true. For a while, it's not true, okay? There's no evidence to suggest it's true, okay? Tweet comes out, tons of coverage, okay? That steep partisan gradient again, right? So when I did a poll, and we asked people, do you think that the unemployment statistics were manipulated? Okay? More than 80% of Republicans said yes. More than 60% of independents. Okay? Even more than 20% of Democrats. I don't know. People are cynical. Okay? But here's what's interesting, right? Remember I told you that sometimes people who are more educated and sophisticated respond to these kind of corrective information in different ways, or respond to false information in different ways. The flip side of that is they're better able to align their political beliefs with their factual ones. Okay? So when we disaggregate this by how much people objectively know about politics, okay, so this is a series of those questions like I told you earlier, which we use as a proxy for how politically knowledgeable people are. Okay? Here's what happens. Among Democrats, as you move from not knowing very much to knowing more, the probability of agreeing with the statement is going down. Okay? It's basically flat for independents. For Republicans, it's going up. So for the group that's predisposed to believe in this, the folks who are more knowledgeable, objectively, are more likely to believe in this, not less. Okay? So the simple stories of we just need to educate people are not right. Okay? Sometimes education and knowledge help us better align our factual beliefs with our political ones. They don't make us into dispassionate reasoners about issues like this. Okay. So the reactions to this corrective information can sometimes be worse among more sophisticated people. They can be more severe rather than less. Okay? And again, I think our interpretation of these kinds of results that I'm going to show you in a moment is that people are resisting corrective information. They're counter-arguing it. They're thinking of reasons it's not true. Okay? And now I'm going to show you some evidence of how this works in practice. Okay? So this is going to be from a series of studies we're experimentally comparing people who saw corrective information to control groups who didn't. We're going to contrast those and see what effects they have. Okay? That seems like a very simple sort of approach. It turns out it's almost never done, okay? Including in health, to my surprise. But it's important, right? Because if we're trying to reduce misperceptions, we shouldn't just assume that giving people the facts will change their mind. We should actually see, does it, right? And that's the wacky idea that we've been pursuing in this research, what it turned out that people haven't really done. Okay, so the first study conducted during the Bush administration experimentally manipulated mock news articles, realistic mock news articles that included either corrective information at the end or not. So it would be a quote from a prominent figure that was often suggestive of some false belief. And then we experimentally manipulated whether there was corrective information in the article or not. Okay, what happens? All right, I'm going to show you one example result from this study. Okay, this is corrective information undermining the claim that was frequently made by President Bush and high-level administration officials that his tax cuts had increased government revenue, which is a claim that his own economists and virtually every economist think is implausible. Okay? His own economists have repeatedly said that this is not true. Okay, so this is, I think, very consistent with that definition of the inconsistent with the best available evidence. Okay, so the people in the corrective condition saw information suggesting that, in fact, President Bush's tax cuts had decreased the amount of revenue to the government relative to the counterfactual where they had never been passed. Okay, because President Bush was saying things like the tax relief helped increase revenues to the Treasury, which a regular person would interpret as meaning we have more money now. Okay. So what happens when we ask that we show people this corrective information or not, and we ask them, did President Bush's tax cuts increase government revenue? Okay, seems pretty straightforward, right? Wrong. Okay, so for liberals, it's somewhat effective, right? So again, people's reactions are going to depend on where they fall politically. So here we're looking at liberals and conservatives. The Democrat and Republican breakdowns are almost identical. Okay, so for liberals, belief in that misperception goes down slightly if they get the corrective information. But for the group that's most predisposed to believe in this, which is in this case is conservatives, belief essentially doubles. Okay, this is what we call the backfire effect. Okay? And I'm not going to tell you that it always happens when we give people information like this. It doesn't. But it can happen on controversial issues. If it provokes people, corrective information provokes people to counter-argue that information. Right? So in this case, saying that President Bush is wrong in that way appears to have caused this group of folks to resist that information, to counter-argue it in their mind. In the process of thinking why it might be true that President Bush's tax cuts increased government revenue, they ended up convincing themselves more of that in the first than they would have if they hadn't seen the corrective information. Okay. And we found a similar result in a study of telling people there were no weapons of mass destruction. Okay. Other studies we found, we didn't always find this again, but it's at least a threat that we need to take seriously. Okay. Death panels. Okay, this is the Sarah Palin Facebook post that launched the death panel myth. She claimed her parents or baby with Down syndrome would have to stand in front of Obama's death panel. Okay, so this came out in August of 2009 when the healthcare debate was really starting to crank up, caused a huge uproar, became a big part of the debate over the law. So again, what happens if the media tells people this isn't true? This is actually a myth the media was pretty aggressive about. They aren't always. They're often quite deferential. But a lot of the coverage was pretty aggressive. So here's a New York Times article, false death panel rumor. What happens when people see coverage saying that the death panel myth is in fact not true? Okay, so again, my co-authors and I investigated this using a mock news article. Okay, and this is what it looks like. This box in red here is that corrective information that we experimentally manipulated. Okay, and what happens? Right, when they're told nonpartisan healthcare experts have concluded Palin is wrong. Okay, so there's good news and bad news. Okay, this is a little bit of a complex figure, so I'm going to walk you through it. Okay, remember I said people's responses varied in some cases based on how sophisticated they are. Okay, so we have in the left panel a representative person with low political knowledge measured objectively, and a person with high political knowledge. Okay, now here's a little bit of a twist. We did this study in 2011. By then, opinions about Sarah Palin did not fall neatly along partisan lines. Some Republicans in our sample did not like her either. Okay? So it turned out that how people felt about Sarah Palin was what seemed to affect how they responded to this corrective information, not party affiliation. Okay, so what we're looking at here is how do responses to that corrective information vary based on how you feel about Sarah Palin and how much you know about politics. Okay, so that's what's going on here. Okay, on the left here, let's take the low knowledge person first. Okay, you can see that the more you like Sarah Palin, the more likely you are to believe in death panels. Right, that's what that upward slope is telling you. Okay, but the effect of the correction, these are predicted probabilities of believing in the myth, is to move those predicted probabilities down. Okay, and the shaded area indicates the group for which that effect was statistically significant. So you can see that for folks who feel neutral to very warm about Sarah Palin, the predicted probability of believing the death panel myth goes down. Okay, so it's working, right? That's the good news, right? So for the low knowledge folks, it's working. But we get to the high knowledge folks, different story emerges, right? So the first thing you can see, much steeper slope upward here, right? That's indicating that for those high knowledge folks, the matching between their feelings about Palin and their beliefs in the myth is much tighter, right? Second, you can see that there's a small statistically significant decrease in believing in the myth for the folks who can't stand Sarah Palin, but almost none of them believe in the myth anyway. Okay. At the other end of the spectrum, though, for those folks who feel very warmly about Sarah Palin, up to loving her like their mother, the belief in death panel myth is going up. Okay. So in some cases, you may need to be more politically sophisticated to effectively counter-argue these myths, right? You're better equipped to do that. You have more information. You're better at reasoning. You're better able to defend the beliefs you'd like to defend. Okay?
Well, this is a subjective measure of low and high knowledge. It's self-reporting.
This is objective. Objective.
Self-reporting?
No, this is an objective measure.
So you've measured this before?
Yes, it's a battery of knowledge questions. Things like how many votes does it take to override a veto, who's the vice president, things like that. Yeah, please.
Have you noticed any, or have you tested whether if the corrective information is presented earlier in the message, if that makes a difference?
It's a good question. We have not tested that experimentally. I've argued for that. So I used to write a column for CJR, and I did a lot about the problems with the approach that journalists often use, which is to restate the myth, restate the myth, restate the myth, and then have the tiny correction at the end. And I have an example of that I can show you later, but I haven't tested experimentally. My suspicion is that it would be more effective to lead with the correct information. Again, what effect that would have on people's beliefs, I'm not sure. Okay, but I've also done research that suggests that fact-checking might help to constrain elites. And if they received coverage like that, that highlighted the false information more prominently, that might help effectively constrain them too.
Well, it seems like based on like inoculation theory that might help if it was introduced earlier.
Maybe, or it might prompt a kind of source derogation response where people think that it's biased, right? So I think it's an empirical question.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's definitely worth testing. I agree. I definitely take the point. All right, so let's turn to health. There's a lot of misinformation out there about vaccines. Okay, it's been in the news recently. Why are some people opting out of vaccines? Okay. Overall, the vaccination rates in this country actually never went down to the same extent that they did in the UK after the infamous article was published saying that vaccines cause autism. Okay, but there's a lot of concern that some kind of response could happen in the United States. There are certain areas that have exemption rates that are at least creating concerns about maintaining herd immunity. Okay, and again, there's this fear that the misinformation that's out there is contributing to that vaccine hesitancy. Okay, so one poll found that 25% of American parents think some vaccines cause autism in healthy children, even though all the scientific evidence suggests this isn't true. Okay. So again, under the deficit model, we would expect that the best way to counter this information is to get that in front of parents and say, look, vaccines don't cause autism. Here's the science, right? Because scientists, after that article was published, went out and did all these studies proving that there's no association between vaccination and autism. Okay. But you will not be surprised to hear at this point in the talk that it does not generate the response you might anticipate. Okay, so we did a nationally representative study of American parents with children at home age 18 or under. Okay, and we contrasted people who saw corrective information from the CDC documenting the scientific evidence that vaccines don't cause autism and compared them to a control group. We also looked at some other messages about vaccines I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, but I won't talk about right now. Okay, we looked at two outcomes. So to this point, we've been looking at just whether they believe in the myth in question or not. But in this case, we looked at their intention to vaccinate a future child, which is the bottom line from a public health perspective. Okay, so I'm going to show you results for both of those. Okay, this is what that information that was shared with them looks like. This is basically straight off the CDC website. If it looks like horrible scientific gobbledygook, it is. If you think, wow, I would never write this and put it out there for parents, I've had that response myself. Okay, but this is their language, and we wanted to test their language. Okay, so one of the things that's important, I think, in bridging the gap that translational science often tries between social science and practitioners is to test the actual language people use. Because sometimes in our social science studies, we construct artificial manipulations to test theories, which is great. But in a lot of cases, the empirical question of how people are responding to the actual information they're being exposed to matters more. Okay, and we can use our social science theories to understand that response, but we need to use realistic stimuli to understand how these things are working in the real world. And I think this is a great case of that. Okay? So what happens when parents see this compared to a control group? Okay? The good news, beliefs in autism go down. Okay? So relative to a control group, the group who were assigned to see that corrective information were less likely to believe that some vaccines cause autism. It's not on this slide, but there was no effect on their overall level of belief in side effects from the MMR vaccine. So it seemed to be working on the myth in question. It didn't seem to be changing their perceptions of vaccine safety overall. And there was no differential based on how they felt about vaccines. Okay? There was no significant difference in how people responded to that information based on their prior attitudes towards vaccines. Okay. But, you knew there was a but. When it comes to their intention to vaccinate a future child, the response varied a lot by their prior attitudes towards vaccines. So we asked them a battery of questions measuring those attitudes in a prior wave of the survey. Okay? And here what we're doing is disaggregating those we're grouping parents into 3 approximately equally sized groups based on that measurement. So these are what you call terciles, right? So the third of parents who have the least favorable attitudes towards vaccines, the middle third, and then the third with the most favorable attitudes. Okay, so for those parents in the middle tercile and the parents with the most favorable attitudes towards vaccines, they overwhelmingly say they will vaccinate a future child, and none of the messages, including the corrective information, have any effect. Okay, so, but they're not the concern, right? The parents who have more favorable attitudes towards vaccines are very unlikely to opt out of vaccination, as indicated by the levels of intention to vaccinate, even in the control condition. Okay? The concern is those parents who have the least favorable attitudes towards vaccines. Okay? Now, again, I want to be clear. This is approximately the bottom third of US parents. So don't think of the hardcore vaccine skeptics, which are really a tiny percentage of Americans. This is the broader set of parents who have more mixed attitudes towards vaccines, okay, rather than negative. The average response on a 5-point scale is about in the middle for this group. Okay? And what happens, let me zoom in, is that when we gave them that corrective information, their intention to vaccinate a future child plummeted, okay, by more than 20 percentage points. Okay? So from around 70% to around 50%. Okay? And you can see, again, this is a group that's of the greatest public health concern. Their baseline intention to vaccinate a future child, to say, I'm very likely to give MMR to a future child if I had one, was only 70% to begin with. Okay? So this is a more hesitant group. Now, we know empirically most of these folks will end up vaccinating, hopefully. Okay? But this is not the kind of response we want to generate. Okay? And what we think is going on is similar to that idea I described to you earlier. Okay? In this case, though, it doesn't seem like people were doubling down on the belief in the myth itself. They weren't counter-arguing and defending that belief in the myth, right? We saw the belief in the myth went down. What we think happened instead is they were defending their overall attitude towards vaccines. Okay? They were thinking of, well, maybe the vaccines don't cause autism, but I have these other questions and concerns about vaccines. I've heard these other things about why they might be dangerous or a bad idea. And in the process of bringing those to mind in response to that information, they ended up feeling more negatively towards vaccines than they might otherwise. Okay. So, more research obviously needs to be done. Yes, please.
Could this just be a knee jerk? Have you gone back like a week later and checked again and see if their attitudes have changed any? If they kind of...
I mean, all experimental effects will tend to decay, so I would expect that it would collapse back. Well, I mean, what I would submit to you is that would be true of the good messages too, but I don't know how this ends up helping, I guess would be the way I would say it, right?
I'm thinking, what if they're trying to, they haven't processed the information yet, they're still reacting.
See, would your hypothesis be that they would end up feeling more positive over time?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, empirical question. We did not do that. This survey was very expensive. So anyone would like to offer us a grant to do long-term follow-ups? My wallet is open. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was wondering what the results would have been that the researcher himself said that it was all falsified. You know.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Okay, let me give you my concern about that. There's a kind of social desirability you can induce in survey respondents when you tell them, I, with the authority of me being the surveyor, tell you this is right. People will become compliant under those circumstances in a way that I don't think is especially externally valid. Okay? And we have lots of evidence of this from different kinds of surveys. So I thought this was a more realistic representation of what they would experience, which is they're going to read something saying the CDC and the AAP and these other institutions say this isn't true. What do you think? You know, but I am going to get to later, but let me just say right now, maybe the best analog to that would be your child's pediatrician. Okay, so one thing that we've recommended to people when they said, what should we do after this, is we say providers may have an important role because they can say that in a naturalistic way. Like it's me telling them that the science is real has no external analog, right? But the doctor does, right? The doctor can say, look, this science is real, I vaccinate my own children, and here's why you should too. Parents overwhelmingly name their child's doctor as their most trusted source of vaccine information. So I think at a much higher rate than these kinds of agencies were described that are cited in that information. So I think that might be a better approach.
Did you collect other information, potential confounding factors like dietary habits, religious beliefs, or such?
It's an experiment, so those should all be orthogonal to the experimental effect. They won't change the experimental effect. We didn't look at them as changing the treatment effect. Is that what you're thinking of?
Well, by chance, I'm conducting a similar survey,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm collecting. So I'm asking kind of a question like this. I can link you to the survey, but I'm collecting also information about the dietary habits and religious beliefs, lifestyle habits, and so on. And there is very well. What I found, I'm doing factor analysis, preliminary studies, basically cluster the population into these kind of completely orthogonal subpopulations. And one, for instance, has particular dietary habits and these beliefs in vaccination,
Right.
or particular religious beliefs and beliefs or not in vaccination, and so on. It's like political,
Right.
it's like the pictures you have shown before about political beliefs, and then the trends in
What's your sample?
my sample.
Is it national representative?
It's an
Students?
international representative from, I'm collecting data from social media. It's a voluntary.
Social media, okay. Well, so here's what I would say. In the US, so there's this question of, are there other kinds of dimensions like this that might predict responses to vaccine information? The people who don't actually vaccinate in the United States are a very diverse group that don't sort cleanly along these kinds of lines, I would say. Now, your cluster analysis will find some clusters, but if you look at the exemption data, what you'll see is there are clusters in places like Marin, California. There are high exemption rates in Idaho. There was a big measles outbreak among the unvaccinated Amish in Ohio. There was an outbreak among the Orthodox in New York City. Okay, so it's not a simple kind of natural health story. We've tried some things like that, and they haven't consistently moderated the treatment effects we've found. It won't, again, because it's an experiment, it won't change this treatment effect. You might wonder whether the treatment effect varied based on the group, and that would be an interesting question to look at. Let me just show you one more result before we go to, oh, I'm sorry.
I had a very similar question. Are there other demographics to go here other than most or least favorable towards vaccines?
That overwhelmingly is the moderator that seemed to drive this. Again, because this is such a heterogeneous, vaccines aren't well organized along demographic lines. Yeah.
What jumped out at me when you put up the information that was presented in
Mm-hmm.
the survey was that the very first sentence was an all or nothing. There's, all children.
Oh, we standardize this across every treatment. Yeah.
Right, and I wonder if that skepticism is just that there are exceptions. A child that's going through therapy, that there's a natural skepticism when you see a word like all.
That was standardized across all the messages we tested to just make it seem a little less jumpy. If that were the case, we wouldn't have seen this response. We would have seen that response in all of these. So I can rule that one out. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah, we didn't put immunocompromised exceptions or whatever. Yeah. All right, let me just show you one more result, and then I would welcome more questions. Okay, so this is a study we did of flu vaccine misperceptions, right? A very different kind of vaccine, one that is not part of a school entry requirement like childhood vaccines are, right? The vaccination rates are much lower for the flu vaccine, unfortunately, right? It's this kind of mundane illness that kills tens of thousands of people a year, and yet we think of as this kind of innocuous, everyday occurrence rather than an important public health issue, okay? And again, we're testing corrective information. Here it's about whether the flu shot can give you the flu, which is something you've all probably heard, right? Not true, okay? But it turns out more than 40% of Americans think that's true. The sample of this here is US adults instead of US parents. Again, we're gonna look at belief in vaccine misperceptions as well as the intention to vaccinate a future child. There's also a message about the disease that we can talk about in the Q&A. Okay, so the result is strikingly parallel to that last study, okay? Belief in the myth that vaccines can give you the flu went down, okay? Now here we had more constrained survey space, so we had one question prior to experiment that asked people about their level of concern about vaccine side effects, okay? And so essentially in the last study, we were looking at the third of parents with the least favorable vaccine attitudes. Here we're looking at approximately the quarter of US adults with the highest level of side effects concern about vaccines. And when we disaggregate the responses, the results look very parallel for whether the flu shot can give you the flu. And again, there's no response on overall perceptions of vaccine safety, okay, relative to a control group. Okay, but the final but of the talk, okay, when it comes to how likely are you to get a flu shot during this flu season, okay, there's no effect on those folks who have low levels of concern about side effects. But for those folks who have high levels of concern, seeing that corrective information made them less likely to say they would get a flu shot. Okay? And again, this is a strategy that is widely used. I mean, I couldn't have scripted it better. I mean, the FDA, I think, tweeted a picture, a giant graphic of myth, flu shot can give you the flu, like a couple of weeks ago, okay, as part of an effort to promote the flu shot, right? But these data suggest that people seem to be responding to that by thinking of reasons not to get the flu shot. Concerns they have, reasons they might not want to get it. You know, we can't look into their minds, okay? But this is not the response they presumably hope to get. And again, we use language direct from the CDC. I'd be happy to share the study with you. Okay, so let me stop here and just say that I hope I've at least convinced you that we should take these questions more seriously and test the messages we use experimentally. Misperceptions have deep psychological roots, and the way people respond to corrective information might not be what you expect. So, more questions, please. Yeah.
So my question is, this is fascinating and really incredibly frustrating, but so what might work?
Yes, that's always a question. Okay, I was ready for that. Okay.
I thought you might.
It's always the first question. Okay, so avoid this kind of myth-busting strategy. Okay, it may not only generate those disconfirmation bias type responses, but there's some evidence from psychology that it can make these myths more familiar, and we use familiarity as a heuristic to indicate accuracy. So over time, familiar things come to feel more true, okay, is the claim. So it seems like this kind of strategy is a questionable one. I'm not prepared to say we should never use it, but we should test it carefully if we're going to. Okay, and again, this is common in the health world, right? Myths, facts, myths, facts. And the fact-checking world, too, in my world of politics and political journalism. Okay? Might be what we talked a little bit about sources before, right? So one thing is find credible sources, right? Public health agencies turn out not to be especially credible sources, right? How much do you trust government vaccine experts and officials? 23% a lot. Okay? How much do you trust your children's doctors? 76% a lot. Okay, so pediatricians, nurses, PAs, NPs, right? Those people on the front lines of health, they may be the most effective advocates for vaccines. And there's a pediatrician at the University of Washington who's doing really important work on how to help doctors talk more effectively to patients about vaccines and how to screen patients to identify those who might be most at risk of opting out so that they can be effectively, so that the practice can essentially try to address their concerns. Because there's often there's a severe time constraint in any well-child visit for anyone who's ever been either a parent or a provider, okay? But that extends more broadly from the vaccine debate. This is a story I love from the death panels myth. When that controversy was going on, an ABC News story that said, even healthcare experts who don't support the Affordable Care Act agree that death panels aren't real. Okay, so the idea is this is someone speaking against their political interests, someone who might share your political sympathies if you're someone who's inclined to not like the Affordable Care Act and therefore believe in the death panels myth. Okay, so that might be a more credible source to people. Okay, and we've done some research looking at this with think tanks and media outlets that's consistent with this kind of a story. I've recommended using graphical information. I presented some on this yesterday at Frank. We find some evidence that graphical information might be more effective than text. This is climate data that we found was much more effective at showing the global warming trend, and especially showing how similar the measurements were across 4 independent data sources than equivalent textual information. Okay? And then this is an analogous story I love from CNN where they wrote a story about the birther myth, which is so difficult to counter, and they just threw up a giant image of Obama's birth certificate and a giant image of his birth announcement in a Hawaiian newspaper in 1960 whatever, right? At the top of the story. You just can't ignore it. Okay, so those kinds of things might be more effective. But, and this is something I think I alluded to earlier, it's important to hold elites accountable because they're often the ones who are getting these things off the ground in the first place. Okay, and I did a field experiment where we sent letters to state legislators telling them that they were, a random set of state legislators telling them that they were vulnerable to being fact-checked by fact-checkers in their state. And we found that they were less likely to have the accuracy of their statement questioned, okay, than an equivalent control group. So even if these stories, so I always tell journalists, I guess, let me just say one thing for those of you who are journalists or potential journalists in the room. Sometimes people see this stuff and say, well, should I not fact check at all? And my answer is no, because you have to hold the elites accountable, right? Sometimes they worry that they're making the problem worse, but I say, but you need to hold the elites accountable because they respond to the kinds of coverage they get, okay? But you should also think about the best ways to present corrective information to hold them accountable in the first place. What do you think? I told you.
Those all make good sense to me. With the health issue, I wonder if, to some extent, the people's reactions, particularly with things affecting their children, are the sort of better safe than sorry, or kind of a belief in the parental instinct, right? Well, there must have been some reason I felt badly about vaccines. Do you know what I mean? That okay, so maybe it's not autism, but I wouldn't be so concerned about this vaccine if there wasn't something problematic about it.
And vaccines really provoke that kind of a response more than a lot of things. They seem to trigger a kind of instinctual reaction in a lot of people. There's something about the act of, it's not like other healthcare treatments, right? Where someone is ill and we give them a treatment and they get better. You are better and we will give you this thing for some long-term benefit that you can't observe and it may never be relevant, right? And there's some small risk, however small, that's still scary if you're a parent, right, of something bad happening, right?
Well, and particularly because having your child vaccinated, particularly when they're young, can be a very traumatic experience.
Oh yeah, they cry and wail, and yeah.
For the child and the parent.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. No, it's.
Why would I do something that's going to make my child scream and maybe even feel bad for several days?
Well, and there's a kind of omission-commission bias that goes on where it's like, I did it to them, right? If it happens that they get sick, you didn't do it to them. But if they had some reaction to the vaccine, however improbable, you did it, right? And even if they're crying and wailing, you did it to them, right? So that's I think, hard. And again, that's where I think helping the providers be more effective is key, because they're negotiating that with the parents. And I think a lot of providers, unfortunately, have started to acquiesce in certain places where these kinds of resistance are more common. Okay, so when my son was born, we went to a pediatric practice affiliated with a major research university, but in a place where there might be some more vaccine hesitant folks. And they said, we're willing to work with you on vaccines. That was the first thing they said. And we said, no, we want everything. My wife and I said no, but that was their opening offer. And that's when we get into all these alternative schedules and other things that leave kids vulnerable and start people down the road to this customization stuff, which is really dangerous. You want to go to Chris? Yeah.
Does narrative appear to work any better than image and text?
Sadly, no. So in this study, this narrative condition was a CDC approved and designed narrative that told the story of one infant who became ill with the measles. And it was specifically designed, I think, to be more relatable than these kind of abstract discussions of danger. And it was a baby who was too young to get vaccinated, so it set aside the issue of what the parent did. And it was just, this is a vulnerable kid who almost died as a result of measles, basically the message being, we don't want this to happen to your kid. And we found no, I think you got the computer there. We found no effect on people's intention to vaccinate relative to the control. Okay, and similarly with two other messages. One was we showed them images of people with these diseases. So one story you'll often hear, and I think there's something to this, is vaccines have been a victim of their own success. They've been so successful that the threat from measles is completely abstract. I've never seen measles in my life. I'm 30, oh God, how old am I? I'm old, okay? I'm in my mid-30s, I've never seen measles. There are people older than me who've seen measles or had measles, but it's incredibly abstract for people who are having children now. And so the idea was make that threat more tangible by showing them images of children with these diseases. Had no effect. Okay? And the narrative and images, in some cases, seem to push up fears about vaccine safety in an unexpected way. We're not really sure why. Okay? It may have made the idea of sick children more accessible to them cognitively. And then finally, we gave them the standard disease information risks from something called the VIS, which is that piece of paper you get when your kids get vaccinated. And that didn't work either. Yeah, folks we haven't heard from especially. Yeah, please.
Have you, back to your best practice one about avoid reinforcing the misperception, do you have any empirical evidence that by listing misfact will reinforce their previous bias or myth?
So this is from a study by Schwartz et al. I'd be happy to send you. And this is, they call it the illusion of truth effect. And that's the idea that I was describing earlier, where these myths, over time, you can remember them and the true false tag falls off them in our mind. We just know we've heard it. We can't remember if it's true or false anymore. And the fact that it's familiar, we're more likely to misremember the myths as true. And that's the danger, they claim, in addition to the kind of responses that I've generated. So I haven't specifically tested this one, but their claim was,
over time?
yeah, they do. In their studies, they do delays from like 30 minutes to like a day or a week, and they find that's the claim. Yeah. Yeah. Other folks. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I thought this was fascinating.
Oh, thanks.
I want to ask you a question. I'm a dietitian, and so I deal with a lot of different nutrition myths. Good carbs versus bad carbs, gluten, and to help try to teach behavior change, and people come in with, and they're certain that the various, so it's a challenge because facts don't really work. Not when I was in college, we were taught to bring a stack of handouts.
Oh.
You give them the facts.
Right,
but that didn't help with weight loss or sometimes controlling blood sugar or other disease. So anyway, so that's why I thought this was quite interesting, because for my health care field, what I've been doing is motivational interviewing. Start where they're at, don't say they're wrong, and try to get under all the layers and go that direction. Yeah, yeah. No, I had a conversation with a provider about this motivational interviewing idea, and they said it's very hard for people because the reasons that people might actually, the idea of motivational interviewing, tell me if I'm explaining this right, is you're supposed to find the things that might motivate them to engage in behavior change. Right, you also almost don't do much talking.
You're listening.
You're listening, and you ask questions to elicit.
Right. Right. So the example this provider was telling me about was smoking. And so they might say, well, I'm going to tell you that smoking causes lung cancer. But it turned out that if you listen to them, they're actually more worried that smoking will make them wrinkled. Right? And so you actually have to reorient yourself as a provider to focusing on that motivation, which might cause them to change the behavior, rather than giving them all the science about their lung cancer risk and blah, blah, blah. And that's a really different kind of approach. Yeah, no, I think that's an important one, and obviously providers, unfortunately, are often taught, especially doctors, sadly, to talk and not listen, right? I mean, there are all these statistics about doctors won't let patients talk for more than 9 seconds without interrupting them, right? So, I mean, I think it shows, again, that just spewing science at people isn't the right response. We have to listen and find the values that are important to them.
Right, which went against my education.
Right.
Because you learn all these facts.
Right.
And some of it is the placebo effect, too. People feel good, even though there's no scientific facts about what they may be doing.
And health is people's own personal health. We're the biggest motivated researchers about ourselves and our own personal health, right? So, okay, can I ruin everyone's placebo effects? I'm a terrible person. Okay, vitamins don't do anything, okay? All the RCTs say vitamins don't do anything. But man, if you tell people vitamins don't do anything, oh, my vitamins, blah, 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 I feel great, I'm so healthy. You know, we all know people who are very healthy who take vitamins, and we confuse that correlation with causation, and yeah.
Right, the longevity piece, yeah.
I know someone who writes about healthcare, and she gets the most hate mail about stuff like vitamins and diet, right? Worse than my political hate mail. It's amazing. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No. Let's see.
You want to go first?
Actually, mine's really broad.
Yeah.
So we're facing this country in my lifetime the greatest polar extremism they've ever seen. We cannot meet in the middle. There is a backlash. If I say something liberal, you'll say something conservative, and it goes worse and worse and worse. And we're missing the middle ground. A lot of factors that you've given me are probably contributing to this. How do we find the middle ground?
Well, okay. let me take a step back and give you my political science perspective. Okay. So the big picture on this is that the polarization we see now is the norm, not the exception. Okay. So let me just put all this in a larger perspective, just going along with what you said, right? So we're all struggling with this idea of politics being so polarized. How do we find a middle ground? How do we agree on a reality? And I think the problem is we tend to think of this kind of mid-20th century ideal of bipartisan coalition making and things like that as what politics should be like. Okay. The problem is that that is a historical anomaly. The talk is now completely different. This is now completely different from what we talked about. That's a historical anomaly. Okay? So if you actually look at partisanship in the US Congress, or polarization on roll call votes, it plummets in the mid-20th century, and now we're returning back to the previous norm. Okay? So that was an exception, not the norm. Okay? And unfortunately, and the sad news and the reason it's not likely not to come back is it was driven by the ugly history of race in this country, especially race in the South. The Democrats ran the South as a one-party region for that whole period, and essentially were kept in the Democratic Party by these historical factors having to do with race and segregation, and that created almost a third party in the South that allowed for that. So this is the time of when people would say there's not a dime's worth of difference, is the famous quote about the two parties, right? They weren't ideologically distinct, okay? And at the time, my tribe, political scientists, we were saying it would actually be better if the parties were more different. So this is how far we've come. There's a very famous report the American Political Science Association put out, famous by my standards, saying we need more distinct parties so people can make a choice. And now we're there, right? People have no problem seeing differences between the parties right now, right? But it turns out there were two things we didn't really think about carefully when we got to this place, okay? And I should just say that the race thing, once civil rights happened and the parties reoriented in race, the South stopped being like it was, we've repolarized. But our institutions don't work very well under conditions of high polarization because it's so easy to block action in our system of government. And we have this problem that I'm focusing on, the second piece of that, which is it turns out that people aren't just polarized about opinions, they're polarized about facts. And that's the challenge we have that I'm trying to work on is figure out how I actually, as a political scientist, don't have a problem with polarization as such. Like opinion polarization is fine. Like I was saying before, it turns out when you learn more about politics, you actually get more polarized. Okay? Those independent voters who people like to mythologize as like who are carefully considering the two parties and deciding who to vote for based on their merits, they don't exist. Okay? They honestly don't exist. Okay? Lots of people say they're independents. Most of them are lying. Okay? So if we ask them, which party do you feel closer towards or lean towards? Overwhelmingly, they vote for one party or the other. Okay? The true independents who really have no preference don't know anything about politics and don't care about politics. And that's why they're totally independent. Okay? And they're disconnected. They're tuned out. Okay? The people who care about politics tend to prefer one side. So that's all fine with me. In some ways, it's better. But we have to figure out how to find facts we agree on. Right? And we need institutions that help create appropriate incentives. Right? So let me just go back here to this and just say, like, this is back to our field experiment with the state legislators. If we have institutions that create incentives for elites to be responsible in the factual statements they make, then that can help give people cues to help them form the right choice. Right? When both sides are saying something is true, or both sides are saying something is false, that's powerful. Okay? But we need media to hold people accountable. We need expert communities that hold people accountable. Okay? And that's where also where all of you come in. In your own respective professional communities, there may be ways you can help create those sorts of consensuses, right? So let me give you an example, and we'll close on a happy note because I know we have to end soon, okay? Let's take smoking, okay? Maybe not a replicable example, but I think a fantastic one. The belief that smoking causes cancer cuts across every line of difference in this country. Overwhelming. It's higher than evolution, the age of the earth, global warming, you name it. Take any controversial factual or scientific belief. Smoking causes cancer is a consensus, okay? On that, science won, okay? And it was driven by the fact that eventually it became embarrassing to deny that fact. Now, smoking is a special case in lots of ways because so many people knew relatives who died or became ill because of smoking, and that we had so many documents coming out of court cases showing that even the cigarette companies themselves knew smoking causes cancer and other illnesses. Right? So maybe it's not fully replicable, but I think it's an example of the power of these kinds when there's an overwhelming expert consensus, and the elites on both sides fall behind it, how powerful that can be. All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you guys very much.
I'm sure we could go all afternoon. I had a whole handful of questions I didn't get to ask. One quick reminder, if you didn't sign in, please do so before you leave. And just a small token of our appreciation. It's a bunch of gator gear to hopefully convince you to come back and continue this conversation again soon.
Thank you guys.
Thanks everybody.
All right, bye.
Great job.
Thanks for coming.